Tim, I am super honored to be here. We thank you in advance for just the time that you will take and have taken to get this whole meeting set up. So what we intend to do in the time that we have with you is just to get a sense of who Tim Howes is, the whole story of LDAP. I know that our customer base is very interested. They use your technology and the team that you worked on this with every day, all around the globe. And we'll discuss that, a little bit about the history, and then move on to other subjects that I think people are interested to hear your voice on, which is about the future of security, the future of identity, things of that nature. So first, let's talk about Tim Howes.
Sounds good.
So let's go through the basics. Background, where did you grow up? Talk to me about your education. What were you interested in?
So I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and went to the University of Michigan all the way through college. I was actually aerospace engineering my undergrad, and then I didn't switch to computer science until grad school. And I was actually, the story of LDAP begins when I was in the middle of getting my PhD and was really kind of casting about, unhappy with my current direction, and so I took a couple of years off to work for the university's Information Technology Division, and that's when LDAP came up, which we can get into more later. But then I ended up going back and finishing my PhD based on not LDAP itself, but some work on top of LDAP.
Interesting. So let's put a pin in that, because clearly you saw problems, and it seems like you and a great team invented some solutions. But we'll come back to the story of LDAP. I kind of want to understand, like, when you trace your career, and we're not going to roll out your CV here, but you've seen a lot. I want to get some sense of the more foundational experiences you've had from ClearStory, Netscape, both of which you made huge impacts in. What forged you in that experience? We both lived, I'm showing my gray hair as a 50-year-old guy in the tech space, but we've seen a lot, from
For sure. Yeah.
Truly the birth of the internet.
Yeah.
So talk to me about some of those foundational experiences.
The early days when somebody would mention internet, you turned around and it was somebody you knew.
Yeah.
But now it's everywhere. I think, a couple things for me. Those early days at the University of Michigan was sort of where I discovered the internet and, really got into programming and networking and infrastructure, and that was very foundational. And then, as I moved on to Netscape, Netscape taught me the value of great marketing and sales, because, they took this thing that we had created at Michigan, LDAP, and through a tremendous marketing and PR effort and lining up a bunch of companies in support of it, really kind of catapulted LDAP to the next level, which was not something that I had really imagined.
Yeah.
So I learned a lot about that. That was definitely foundational. I think, after Netscape was acquired by AOL in 1999, I left after a few months to co-found a company called LoudCloud, which later gained fame as when we changed our name to Opsware, got sold to HP for $1.6 billion, and it was the foundation of Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. That was the crucible in which I learned a lot about management and startups and, really managing through some tough situations, because that whole story was one of a rocket ride up. We could do no wrong, and the company was going so well, and we were all geniuses. And then a rocket ride straight to the bottom where, we were complete idiots and worth less than the cash we had on hand in the company. And so, you go through something like that, and it really, one, teaches you that nothing else, it's not, whatever's happening, it's not so bad, because that was pretty much the worst thing. But then to really fight and claw and scrap my way through that with all that great team of people we had there was, it was a great experience. It was one of those both best and worst time of my life. For sure.
I know, it's, people ask me very similarly, you've seen a bunch, you've had companies that work, you've, operated companies that have failed. and what is the juice now for me especially, and of course it used to be the technology, the product, then it became the business model, and playing which is an instantiation of another product. Now it's about the people and those that can brave those storms together. I mean, you're invincible, but that's an interview for another time. For sure. I have to ask you about know yourself as well. I mean, this is now, you've had all these commercial successes. Tell me about this. This very clearly, when I read the website, is you and your wife giving back, and I want to hear a little bit about this.
So Know Yourself is a children's educational company. We make educational toys and comics and activity kits and other things for kids, with the mission of teaching them about themselves and the world around them. And by teaching about themselves, we really mean like their bodies, their psychology, which I think is an area that is largely neglected in formal education, and is the whole idea really got its start when we had kids and we started thinking, well, what is it we want our kids to know about? And for me, I look back over my life and I think of it like the most valuable piece of information I have now, and the thing that has grown throughout my life is my knowledge of myself and how I work, and the places where I'm strong and weak. And so we really wanted to instill that in them. And when we started looking for materials, there just wasn't a lot out there. And so we decided to kind of do it ourselves. And it's been very much a labor of love throughout the years. We're starting to get some real traction now, which is exciting to see. But yeah, that's kind of a hobby on the side for me these days.
Well, it's clearly more than a hobby. The URL for those who want to check it out is knowyourself.com. Right. Lastly, before we move into the more meatier LDAP juice, mentors. I think that every soul on earth needs a mentor. I think that is, to your point about the theme of know yourself, is self-awareness. And for anyone from a marketer to a software engineer to an executive, being self-aware of your strengths, of your weaknesses, is only as good as the mentors you surround yourself with. And I try and pick and choose mine extraordinarily carefully, just so I know where I'm being navigated. For you, who in your life or during your career is your North Star?
There's definitely not one person. There have been a lot of people over the years. I remember in the early days of LDAP, there was Marshall Rose and Steve Kill, who were both very influential. Netscape days, there was a guy at Netscape, Eric Hahn, who was a great mentor to me, as well as, when we went into business together with LabCloud and Opsware, Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz.
Correct, yeah.
The guy, though, who to me personifies mentor and who's just the best at that for me, or as far as I can tell anyone else, is the late, great Bill Campbell. Yeah. And I was so lucky to know him. He was a board member of ours at LabCloud and Opsware, and a great advisor to me throughout my career. And there's a reason they called him the coach, because he just, he's just a singular force in the Valley. You can't imagine. I mean, here's a guy who is on the board of Apple and is sitting in Google's executive staff meetings every single week. Yeah. And he pulls that off without anyone getting concerned.
It's unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. And anyways, he's the gold standard.
That's excellent. And you're, very lucky. And I'd love to have met him. Okay. This is where it gets interesting.
All right, let's go.
The story of LDAP. I walk us through this from its inspiration. I mean, you just teased about it a few minutes ago, but this is in principle why we're here. All these people who are listening to this are practitioners, some almost 30 years later, of this technology that has obviously stood the test of time. And there's a reason for that. So let's hear some of the story.
Well, that got its start. As I mentioned, I was at the University of Michigan. And the university itself was kind of going through a transition at the time. They were going from this mainframe system that ran a homegrown operating system called MTS, the Michigan Terminal System. It's a great operating system.
What was it founded on? Was it?
It was a IBM
AS400 or OS390?
OS390 operating system clone, basically. And they were sort of moving away from that to a more distributed system where, campus, email, and directory and so on were all on this mainframe, and they needed something to replace that in the new distributed environment where across campus, this was, late 80s, was starting to pop up all, PCs and Macintoshes and, some Unix machines, Sun Microsystems in the engineering college. And so I got hired as part of a group of young Turks who were kind of charged with leading that rebellion, as it turned out to be. And one of the big problems was, what are we going to use for a directory service? And so at the time, OSI, the OSI stack, 7-layer OSI stack was going to be the next big thing, and it had a directory called X.500.
X500, right.
Yeah, and the problem with X500 was the only implementation you could find was this really gigantic stack of software that was called ISO-DE. It was created by Marshall Rose and Steve Kill and some other folks. And on our campus we had 50,000 students, and they had Macs and PCs, and it was really too much to expect them to run this stack, and I didn't want to port it there. It really only ran on Unix. And so I had, with a couple of colleagues at Michigan, I created something called DIXIE, DIXIE, which was it stood for Directory Interface to X500 Implemented Efficiently or in an internet environment, depending on who we were talking to.
Yes.
I didn't want to offend the X500
Very clever.
people. Yeah. And so DIXIE got some traction. It was a little library and a server and a couple of clients that we wrote. And then some folks that I knew that were working with the IETF had seen it and said, hey, you should really think about creating a kind of a standardized version of this. Come to the IETF and do that. And so that's where LDAP came from. So I went and worked with the IETF to create the protocol LDAP. A couple of folks I worked with at Michigan, Mark Smith and Gordon Good and Brian Beecher, we worked on the first implementation of LDAP, which we made open source and got very widely used and formed the basis for OpenLDAP and a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
And so, really started getting some traction in that environment, and then kind of simultaneously, Netscape was had burst on the scene with the Mosaic browser. And they had seen sort of the writing was on the wall for Netscape. They had seen Microsoft, coming with the browser, and so they were moving as fast as they could to build an enterprise software business based on some server products, web server, mail server, and so on. And they again recognized the need for, with all these different servers, recognized the need for a directory system to tie them together. And so they found us at the University of Michigan. They hired us at Netscape, and that was sort of the beginning of LDAP's commercial success.
Interesting. So was it? Did you commercialize this? And did other companies? Because clearly other larger software vendors were instantiating, the same concept in their own directory infrastructure, so they could sell it on behalf of themselves to their own client base. What was the business thinking? So you had this technology. Where did you want to take it?
Well, for me, certainly when I was at Michigan, I was just trying to solve the problem I had, right? I was trying to solve my problem, which was a directory where everybody could have a your name at umich.edu email address, and you could, at the time the lookup protocol was Finger, right?
Yeah.
Finger me at the University of Michigan, right? And I wanted a directory to support that, and we really had started kind of with identity and email as the backbone, and hadn't started thinking about printers and devices and
other objects.
That really came later. But the original idea was to get as many people to use it as possible, which is why we created the software as open source and got it out there. As a university, that was really our we thought at the time that was our mandate.
For sure.
We were trying to make the world a better place through software.
Yeah.
And it was also the time where Free Software Foundation was recently formed, and so there was a beginning really of the free software movement. And then once I got to Netscape, we took the open source software and used that as the basis of the Netscape directory server. But that, of course, was a commercial endeavor along with everything else that Netscape did. But we still stayed involved with the standards effort, and by that time, a lot of other companies, including Microsoft, had gotten on board with LDAP. Microsoft, I think, a little bit kicking and screaming, but
yeah. We'll talk about those guys
okay.
in Redmond in a bit. So from a technology perspective, was the obviously authentication authorization the primary goal?
Yeah.
We see in our case OpenLDAP, but our directory structure used for its database capacities. Obviously, the management of the metadata about a specific object, like a user, for example. Was that part of your original design, or did you extend into that?
Oh, but that was definitely part of the original thinking, and I really can't take credit for that. I mean, that LDAP got its start as a front end to X500, right?
Correct.
As a lightweight way that we could put a client
shim, so to speak.
Exactly, to X500, and then it was along around LDAP version 3 where it was clear the internet was taking off, X500 not so much, and so we thought, well, let's see if we can kind of break LDAP off from X500, and why not? It's just a protocol. We could make our own database. So that was the open source implementation that really started to take off, and so we inherited a lot of the the data model and so on from X.500, which was, I think, really pretty well thought out and extensible, and we added some things for sure, but that was the original idea.
Yeah, I mean, to my earlier point about standing the test of time, you're right. The abstraction that was put into that original meta model was, there was a lot of forward thinking, which was beautiful to see. Now, and the one quick thing that sparked, so do you think the sort of the adoption, the success of the adoption you had with LDAP and then later on OpenLDAP, was it a function of like Linux actually sort of being run in parallel at the same time? Let me rephrase this. The way I always saw it when I'm sort of doing my history fact checking, X500, mainframe, actual physical things. You had this commoditized way to just get, you had hardware, but you could throw, Linux on this. Was that as much of a conduit to the success of LDAP as anything else? What do you think?
I think LDAP, really started. I mean, the beginning. I think it accelerated LDAP, but LDAP really started to take off before Linux, became a thing. I think Linux really started to get people's attention in, 98, 99 and beyond. Whereas LDAP was pretty firmly established at that point, at least with with Netscape, with Microsoft, with IBM, Novell. Everyone had kind of jumped on the bandwagon at that point. I think the adoption of Linux, which and then a lot of stuff came after that, AWS and containers and everything, but LDAP was kind of on its way by then. Yeah.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure I get my history correct. OpenLDAP. So just some comments on that. Obviously, you guys did, the sort of the communal thing, which is to take LDAP and provide it to the world. Contrast that with what the OpenLDAP organization was doing with this technology.
Well, I think, and I don't know, this was, OpenLDAP kind of got started at the time where I started to get out of LDAP.
Yeah.
So, I wasn't involved with the founding of OpenLDAP. My understanding is that they took the open source code that we had created at Michigan, made, a bunch of changes and improvements, and really tried to sort of create more of a coordinated open software effort around LDAP and the protocol itself and so on. So, from what I can see, they've been successful in doing that. I think it's great. I think, back in the day, the open source LDAP effort was, me and a couple guys at Michigan, right? So it was not it was not a very big coordinated effort.
Yeah, no, it's global. We're we trace the open source kind of movement, all the requests for changes that still are very, very active.
Yeah.
So good. Yeah, the reason why I brought it up was just to contrast. We even hear folks, say the words LDAP, but there is a difference, OpenLDAP and LDAP, and I'm glad to hear your take on it. Let's talk a little bit about Microsoft. You mentioned them before. Obviously this is Microsoft is in every capacity and still remains a juggernaut in many ways.
For sure.
A lot of the success that this company had, beyond being a brilliant sales and marketing engine, was the very clever sort of adaptation of open source standards or other various forms of technology, from operating systems to domain networks to directories, Active Directory, to give you an example. I'm wondering what, as you've witnessed this, over the course of many years now, what are the limitations into wrapping a directory infrastructure into a vendor stack? Clearly Microsoft has a mission.
Sure.
We understand the power of directories. But what are the pros and cons of that? Where do you think Microsoft's limitations are going to show themselves?
Yeah, I think the pros obviously are, you get a standardized interface to everything you have done, right? Your whole stack and your implementations out there. I think the cons are, around fidelity and around performance, where inevitably when, you're mapping from one protocol to another, you'll find areas where, maybe the mapping doesn't quite work that well. We certainly found, back in the day at Netscape, where we spent a lot of time on performance with the directory because we really felt it was the center of a lot of stuff, and it was going to need to handle a tremendous amount of traffic if it was going to be consulted, not just for authentication, but every authorization decision, and not just for people, but devices and other things. And so, performance was really important. And I remember getting accosted at giving a speech on LDAP somewhere, and some guy in the audience accosted me about how he was trying to use one of our Netscape, I think it was a Netscape web server or something, with another vendor's directory system. And I'm actually not sure if it was Microsoft or Novell, but he was talking about, all of the, it wasn't performing well because we were doing so many queries against the directory.
Yeah.
And I think you can look at were we doing too many queries, or had they really not seen LDAP the way we did, which was it was the center of the universe, and so you got to perform well, you got to get done in
absolutely.
milliseconds.
Like in our world, we'll talk. I would like to know your opinions of our company now that we've basically taken this amazing technology, LDAP or OpenLDAP, and have brought it to the cloud. But we are in a time and a place, and the way our company was thinking about things is obviously high-performing, global, and we have now the possibility to use all these modern cloud technologies, of course, that AWS and other open-source companies give us to ensure that this stuff runs at internet speeds. So we're, again, fast forward to this day and age.
Yeah.
This is how we like to often say we've modernized a lot of these very hardened foundational protocols, but brought them to sort of the day and the age and the availability that the internet needs and requires. A couple more things, but identity. Directories are the most foundational, authoritative source of credentials and a user's identity that an organization can have. The source of truth. And you played a role, obviously, in inventing that, which is incredible. But as you've now worked at various organizations, I want to talk about the future. What do you see identity becoming or morphing into? There's so many new standards. We're just curious to your opinions on where you see this going.
I certainly don't have any kind of crystal ball, but I think if you trace certainly the scale has changed dramatically. If you go from, you need to identify yourself to one computer, and then you need to identify yourself to all the different services on your LAN, and now, I read somewhere recently the average person has 92, almost 100 identities on the web.
That's correct. Yep.
And so the scale keeps getting bigger. And then the other thing that's happening is the security seems to keep getting worse, and new ways to definitely new ways to fool authentication systems and phishing attacks, and ways to go around any kind of security that people have set up. So I think some of the drive towards passwordless systems I think is great. I think the ability to authenticate people more on their behavior or their, something that's not a shared secret of some kind, but rather tied specifically to that person, I think in the future is probably going to be a better way to go, at least until AI systems figure out how to
manipulate
that. you as a person.
Man in the AI middle, so to speak. Yeah, we agree. Very much so. And part of the reason why we're so fundamentally behind those statements about behavioral sort of interpretations and conditionally allowing or disallowing access to things is only a function of the type of data that our platform is generating, which is mind-blowing. Like when it's a global product and it's used all around the earth, and when we have the ability to examine the patterns that go on within the totality of our sort of customer base, just looking at how average workers are actually on an average basis accessing stuff right down to a specific organization's patterns. There's some magic there. So we fundamentally believe in that as well. Before we get to the end and we say our goodbyes, JumpCloud, we are honored to have you as an advisory board member.
I'm honored to be advising you.
Which is incredible, and having opportunities like this. Why us? Where do you think this whole ship is headed? What is no crystal balls. We're working very hard, but what could be the reason for our success as we sort of go now global?
Well, I think you look at the world moving more and more to the cloud, but there's still a world left behind in your local environment. You've got devices, you've got printers, you've got everything, and so that people also need to be authenticated in these different contexts. So I think JumpCloud kind of helping to provide a bridge between those worlds, and to do that in a standards-based way, I think is really, really important. And I like you guys have taken LDAP to a scale that nobody else has before, so that's exciting for me to see, and one of the reasons I like working with you guys.
Well, we're honored. Tim, I want to say thank you very much. We know how busy you are here at Facebook, and we just so appreciate this time and the counsel that you've given us.
It's my pleasure.
Cheers. Thank you.